I guess the first thing I should say is Houston, we have a forecasting problem. And fortunately, we have answers. And Howard happened to bring those answers in with him this morning. See, it's that 20-pound book there on the blue one. Well, so that's a summary of all the a summary of all that we know about the science of forecasting. And there is a science of forecasting. The science is when you go out and do experiments and you find out what works in what situations. So we had people from all around the world, experts around the world, and we came up with this set of principles. Thanks to Jane Orient here. Keston Green and Willie Soon and I had been working on a paper to summarize evidence-based climate forecast. It was not going, it's been 2 years now, Willie, right? And we keep having other things come up, but you gave us a deadline, you gave us a chance to do this. I think I've really got the paper outlined, and it's on the front burner. In 1980, I was invited to interview for a chair in marketing at the University of Illinois. And we picked a bad month to go. It was winter. Urbana-Champaign didn't look great, but it had the best marketing department in the country, in my opinion. And it had Julian Simon, and I really wanted to meet Julian Simon. He's like 5 years older than me, and he was already a big impact. So I remember walking around the agricultural plots with him, and he said, this is what science is all about. It's all experimentation. That's where knowledge comes from. And he gave a lot of other good advice. So we got together, spent some time, and for the rest of his life, we were good friends, and he's always been my role model. You'll see in the paper, or my presentation, all sorts of influences from Julian. Things like always go with the evidence, and the Gore bet was motivated by thinking of how Julian would have handled it. I felt that he was living the same life I did only 5 years earlier, so it was really nice for me to be able to get advice as I went through. And I read his Against the Grain recently. I don't know if any of you have read that, but it's a nice book to read when you're going against the grain, which it seems to be a lot of the people in this audience are going against the grain. This is a new talk for me, and I make lots of mistakes in new talks. I sent Jeremy about 16 revisions of this paper, trying to get ready. Adam Smith posed the following question to I've paraphrased it. Posed this question to people. And so what was the answer, according to Adam Smith? Because they received state aid. I feel like I'm visiting 18th century Scotland now. I mean, this is the way a scientific organization acts. Unlike most of the land of academia where I go to, I hardly ever hear an interesting talk. People can come up with topics that they might be interesting to them, and they might think they're important, but they don't seem that way to me. Now I go to an area that I know very little about, still, climate change, and I find this thing fascinating, what you've come up with. So my hats are off to you. You people are doing great jobs with budgets that are a tiny bit smaller than what the federal budget provides for the warmers. Here are some of the findings we've had from research on forecasting. We take room one, we put the best and brightest experts in the world, give them accurate, relevant information. Room two, people of above average intelligence. They have a little bit of information about climate. So which room would produce the most accurate forecast? So room one would do no better than room two. It's astonishing. And what's that based on? Well, I missed part of it. In 1980, I published a paper in the MIT Tech Review called about the seersucker theory. No matter how much evidence exists that seers do not exist, suckers will pay for the existence of seers. So that's based on quite a bit of research up to the time. Phil Tetlock, who's now at our university, came along and wrote a book called Expert Political Judgment. 20 years he spent on this book. 284 experts recruited. They made 82,000 forecasts over this 20-year period. And they were a little more accurate than novices, hardly any difference. And simple rules of thumb turned out to be better than experts. Here's how to get immunity. I mean, that's an astonishing thing. You tell people about that finding, they think, well, that might be true of other people, but it's not true of me. So this means that surveying scientists' opinions about what will happen in the future in climate change is useless. The Carter administration also had a forecast for environment. They used expert opinion, something like the Delphi procedure, not quite, but just soliciting opinion from. We've stepped further past the Carter administration now. We have these opinions put into computers, and then you can translate what the opinions would be, the implications of those are. So it's still on the level of judgment. So what's the alternative if asking scientists is useless? Evidence-based forecasting. We could go for repetition, but I'll ignore it. We've got to rely on evidence-based forecasting principles. And it's analogous to what you do in medicine with evidence-based medicine. I love Glatzer's book, The Cure. Had any of you read The Cure? Yeah, well, Milton Friedman did. It's one of the last book reviews, I think it was the last book review he did before he died. He said it's a great book. He said, here's a guy that knows economics. He's a medical doctor, but he also knows economics. And Glatzer said, progress did not occur until roughly the 1930s when people started taking experimentation seriously. Of course, experimentation had been done before that, but it was not taken seriously. And after that, lifespan began to increase and all these wonderful benefits occurred. And it's all, again, as Julian Simon says, it all goes back to experimentation. So you now live in an evidence-based field, and if you have bad outcomes, you're likely to get sued. And when you're sued, they might say you didn't follow the proper procedures. There's nothing like that in management and business schools. I mean, we make things up. Things go bad. That's the way things are. There's no asking people to adhere to principles. So we do have now a lot of evidence-based knowledge about how to forecast, and we should start using it. My contributions to forecasting, research forecasting for 53 years, did lots of publications in forecasting, co-founded lots of things, worked with others to develop the principles of forecasting. Summarized them in, also my first book was Long Range Forecasting. This didn't mean much to Barbara Boxer when I testified on the polar bear hearings. She kept referring to me as Dr. Scott, the marketing expert. What's a marketing expert's doing here? As she would do that, she would also turn her back on me. She'd tell me how much time I have and then turn her back and talk to her staff. And I'm into Persuasion. I'm thinking, this is great. This is on C-SPAN, you know? So that book was the result of a project conducted from 1995 to 2000. Involved 40 internationally known experts, reviewed by 123 other experts, led to 139 principles in 2001. We've since added one. And we've added more evidence. They're summarized in, you can go on to forecastingprinciples.com and it gives you a little guideline. It takes you through how to audit a forecasting process. Despite this, forecasting practices have been slow to change. And why is that? Well, forecasting is used as a political tool. Firms do it to some extent, interest groups do it, and governments do it a lot. Poor forecasting is unlikely to be punished outside of the free market. If you're in the free market, then you're going to get punished for a bad forecast. But in the government, if you do poor forecasting, it indicates, well, we didn't do enough of what we were doing, so we have to do even more. So they get paid for poor forecasting in the government. Forecasters have been seduced by sophisticated techniques, big data, and computers. So that's what's harming the field now. That's why we're not making progress. People think that the computers are going to do it for us. It's like alchemy, you know? It's the rain dance. People want to pay a lot of money and get the best consulting company. Those consulting companies usually know nothing about how to forecast. I have a summary of this. I review this, one of my lifetime summaries here, called The Illusions of Regression Analysis. And this is going to be posted. It'll be on the website for this organization. It'll be on our websites. But when you get the the PowerPoints, just click on this and you'll go right through to these articles. Illusions of regression analysis are also affecting medicine. There's a wonderful book by Kabat talking about all the silly uses of correlations to find out what makes people live long. I came across this great study the other day. My wife keeps telling me not to eat so much salt. I pay no attention. But then I just read this, what I thought was a fairly definitive thing, saying that the salt, if it tastes good, eat more. You're better off. I sent it to her. She said, "Is that what you're doing during this conference?" Conclusions from evidence-based forecasting for global warming. Forecasting leads to it's needed for making policies, and it depends on this three-legged stool. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but there's no scientifically valid forecast for any leg. They forecasts violate scientific principles. And this is new for us. We've just come up with a paper called the Golden Rule of Forecasting. You should have copies of that list around, and we'll get to it. Were they handed out, or? Okay. Yeah. So you can just, that'll be aware. We'll come back to the Golden Rule of Forecasting. And validation studies show that the climate models used by the IPCC are inaccurate. So it's pretty clear to me, I started this 5 years ago, and I thought this is going to be interesting. I had to give a talk for a forecasting conference, a featured talk. So Kesting Reed said, "Why don't we do it on global warming? They probably have a lot of money. We could get money for forecasting, yeah?" So I went, it took about a week before I realized that this is not a scientific movement on the internet, a week on the internet. It's an anti-scientific political movement, similar to other man-made disasters. Okay, the three-legged stool is you need a validated forecast from evidence-based methods which determine that long-term global warming will occur, and we don't have that. If you did have it, you'd then have to show that there's substantial net harm due to global warming, and we don't have that. From what I read, I'm like everybody else. I like to go south for vacations and live in warm climates and live longer. And if you find that number one is true and number two is true, then you need to show you have cost-effective policies, and we don't have that. Any failure on any one of these is enough to make the whole system collapse. They fail on all three. And my challenge keeps being, there are no scientific forecasts to support any of these three legs. And I meant to say another thing about the illusions of regression analysis and science. One of the confusions about science is people think that if you put a lot of numbers in, equations, and statistical significance, that that's science. And there's been people trying to do these little studies, and they show you can take the same information and you can write it in such a way people can't understand it. I did that study, actually. And people think it's more accurate, more truthful. If you're an expert, it doesn't work for students. So one of the things about the techniques, I talked about sophisticated techniques, just take test of statistical significance. Tests of statistical significance are harmful. Again, I pick up the challenge from Frank Schmidt at University of Michigan, who used it for years. And my challenge is, can anyone show me a study where the use of statistical significance improved decision making? And you know, I've never had any takers. I can show you studies where it's harmed decision making. Lots of studies available where it shows it's a harmful thing. Test of statistical significance. And I get a little annoyed when the climate skeptics use statistical significance. We have evidence that's been going on ever since they were discovered by student that this is crazy. McCloskey and Ziliak, or one of Ziliak and McCloskey, or I forget which way it goes, but that's an excellent historical review of how harmful the notion of statistical significance has been. Here's the audit we did. I talked about the 139 principles. So we had Keston Green and myself independently went through this, and it took a bit of time. We then merged our findings and discussed them. And of the 139 principles, we found 89 were relevant to this situation. The IPCC forecast violated 72 of these. Now, how many people work in a job where you can, violate a lot of principles? As a medical doctor, you might even get trouble for violating one principle. I mean, some of these principles are basic science, like full disclosure of your methods. Full disclosure of methods, assess reliability and validity. Compare forecasts from different methods. Be conservative. So these are some of the 139 principles of forecasting. The results of that audit are in the global warming paper. There's no scientifically valid forecast for the detrimental effects of global warming. Are we? Maybe we're at the optimum temperature right now. As somebody said yesterday, we've been coping quite well with a 1 degree increase. Is warming more harmful than cooling? Is warming more likely than cooling? I noticed the cooling camp is starting to make inroads recently, and more articles about global cooling. No scientific forecast on cost-effective policies. So I was asked by the people in the government of Alaska to evaluate the polar bear forecast, and so I enlisted. Oh yeah. Oh right. I was hoping to meet her as a result of that. And so Willie and I and Keston Green did an audit. They didn't say what it was going to be used for. They just said, do the audit as you think good. There was no pressure at all. And we found that fewer than 14% of the relevant forecasting principles were properly applied by the government forecast. They were forecasting that here the trend in polar bear population had been going up. At the time of the hearings, I think it was 2008, and the forecasts were a dramatic drop in polar bears. Well, it was a faulty forecasting thing. Here's an example. They took 5 years of data, 5 consecutive years of data, and forecasted ahead 100 years. They could have used 6 years. That was the most recent year, but they had reasons why it wasn't a good data point. It turned to show that the polar bears were increasing. From 5 years of data, they're extrapolating ahead for 100 years, and they're reversing the trend. It's not an increase. It's going to be a dramatic decrease. So I offered to bet Barbara Boxer on that one, and she wouldn't respond to that. Look at the bias in the way the reports were all stated. They all say the UGS science strategy to support U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service polar bear listing decision. So they were told what they were supposed to come up with. We wondered what data they were using. Thought it'd be helpful in the audit, so we contacted them, and they said they can't send it to us. They're using it. Yeah, Willie's involved in it. So that's the polar bear population for you. It's also, my Senate hearing is also there if you like. It turned out I had 6 minutes. I was told by Mark Morano, he said, she's going to let everybody talk as much as they want on her side. He says, you're only going to have 5 minutes. So I saved one very long last slide because I know I was going to a little bit run over. And she kept interrupting me about time, and I told her, I said, one more slide. So it's a 6-minute talk. Now, recently, another one of my ambitions in tying my life together is the golden rule of forecasting. What is the golden rule of forecasting? If you have to give people one rule, what would it be? Be conservative. And be conservative is based on guidelines that are also evidence-based. Conservative is, the future is going to be like the past. Relationships that have occurred in the past are going to continue in the future. Behavior from the past will continue in the future. These are things like what's the current level that we're talking about, what's the current trend. Use all previous knowledge, as much knowledge as you have. This means go and check out the literature. Researchers today are saving a lot of time. They don't have to check the literature. They just let the computer do all that work. Domain experts. I don't know much about climate, but I do have Willie around to keep me on the right track, and Mark Morano is very helpful to me. Use forecasting knowledge. That is the evidence-based methods. When should you be conservative? Whenever there's uncertainty, you should be conservative. But especially if you have a complex situation, especially if there's a lot of uncertainty, and especially if you're likely to have bias. We got all three of these in the global warming situation. So the golden rules should apply here. Probably applies to all government policies and sometimes to investment decisions. So conservatism starts with how do you formulate the problem? That has a big effect on how your forecast turns out. Use all the data. With the climate change data, of course, you can pick any period you want and get any forecast you want. Conservatism applies to judgmental methods, to extrapolation methods, to causal methods. And an excellent way, one of the most powerful things we've learned about forecasting is very simple, and that is take different valid approaches, evidence-based approaches, make forecasts with each of them, and then take a simple average. Statisticians had a lot of trouble with that. There's hundreds of studies where they think they can weight the thing and get better forecasts, but they've not been very successful. In fact, my general advice is if you have a forecasting problem, don't go to a statistician. They don't even read the literature about how to forecast. Okay, examples of guidelines. These are the bigger set is out there in the page you had. Use evidence-based methods that have been validated for the situation. Avoid unaided judgment. Damp trends, if the situation is uncertain or stable. This is comparatively recent, but there's been an immense amount of data on this. The young Ph.D. Candidate, he came to me years ago and he said he was looking for a good topic. His name was Ev Gardner, and I said, he's interested in extrapolation method. And I said, come up with a damping method. That made his career. He did a great job on that, all sorts of useful research. Use prior knowledge to select variables and estimate effects. You don't use statistical significance and run stepwise regression and so forth. Fit to the data has no relationship to the accuracy in ex ante forecasts. And combined forecasts from validated methods. Okay. So you have those. Now we had that forecasting audit I mentioned before. That takes a lot of reading, and Willie went into it. Yeah, once you're familiar with the forecasting problem, still you have to go through, do a lot of reading, and check out each of the principles. Now we have something that you can do, once you understand what was done, in 10 minutes. It's astonishing. We've collapsed all this knowledge for the golden rule into, it took Keston 10 minutes, it took me 10 minutes to check the climate, the IPCC forecast against the golden rule. And I think you're also capable of doing that, not just on the IPCC forecast, but on any of the others. "25 of the 27 guidelines were relevant to this situation. And how many did the IPCC follow, or the forecast that they used? They violated 25. So it's not surprising that they get such poor forecasts. The golden rule of forecasting, that's this paper that we're working, that Keston and I are working on, and it'll be online. Notice the parallel to your field of medicine, where there's been all this wonderful research showing that the simple use of a checklist, I guess you're all familiar with that, right? The Gwande, and you know, they had one study had 8 hospitals around the world, 16 hospitals. They took 8 cities, I think it was, and in one hospital they were given a checklist, which was things that people already agreed with. You know, it wasn't anything new. And the other hospital, they just did business as usual. And the question is, how many people died after surgical procedures? The use of a checklist cut the deaths almost in half. Checklists are extremely powerful. Our minds cannot handle many variables. So you have to have aids, and checklists is one of the best aids. Is that a familiar thing?
Fly a plane?
Yeah. Yes, right, airplanes too, yeah. One reason forecasters violate the golden rule is they're not trying to forecast. They're trying to motivate behavior. They do it in companies, and the government does it. And my view is planners are free to create any plan they would like. They can do anything they want. But forecasters should be restricted. Forecasters are restricted to say, here's what this plan is going to lead to. And otherwise, it's senseless. So I think forecasters need to be audited. Here's another reason why people violate the golden rule. They always say things are different now. Of course, I like the way Eisenhower said it. Things are more like they are now than they ever were before, or they ever have been. Had a way with words. Are they different? Is global warming situation any different now? How do we know? Well, you can look at the data and you see they're different, right? So that's what some experts say. Just look at what's happening here. Be skeptical of this. Whenever people say things are different, be very skeptical. Gee, I thought I had the source on here. We tracked it down, but it's not original. We picked it up from a paper that was done about 2009, I believe. I'll have the source on the final slide. We gave a group of forecasters at our annual forecasting meeting, we gave them these two graphs. And we said that these are monthly global mean temperatures for 2 periods. Each period is 1/2 century. And in each case, the data follows the start of the Industrial Revolution. So these are people that are trained in forecasting. We said make forecasts. So the results were, well, first of all, the major point is these look almost identical, don't they? So how can you say that one of the situations is unique? Half of them predicted increased temperatures for both. The other half predicted either no change or declines. And as it turns out, in both cases, temperature went down. These are the 2 periods from roughly 45 to 75, something like that. That was the validation data for data A. After it had been increasing, it went down. And B, that was from 1970 to 70-something to 2000. So, and you're familiar with the data after 2010. So a trend is a trend is a trend. Question is, will it bend? Will it alter its course and come to some unforeseen end, all right, premature end? This is one of the golden rules. It supports the golden rules. If you don't have really clear support for a trend, don't extrapolate a trend. Just assume there's no change. I might say that I should say that Julian Simon was always ahead of me on these things. I know you all know about the Simon and Tiern Ehrlich, Simon and Ehrlich and Holdren bet. And Julian said, pick any resources you want, pick any time period. So Ehrlich came back after checking with Holdren and said, okay, we'll pick 5 metals where the price had been increasing rapidly. And Julian had very long time series on these things, so he knew the prices of all resources goes down. Now, maybe there was something different about these 5, so the question about causal knowledge has been thrown into doubt, so Julian said, no change, they won't change. And of course, he won the bet after 10 years. Ehrlich had a lot of trouble accepting that, so Julian said, would you like to bet again? More influence of Julian. I said, how would Julian have handled this? So I contacted Al Gore about this Gore bet and said, it's not about winning or losing. The thing is, people are not properly validating forecasting methods in the global climate change thing. So what we need to do, and you say yourself as a serious guy trying to get research on this, we need to start doing validation studies. So here's the deal. I'll bet you that I can pick temperature of the next 10 years. I picked 10 years because I want to be around. But I'll bet I can predict better than any climate model you like. So each time I'd get an answer, a nice answer from one of his staff, and there'd be some excuse. So that, he didn't like to bet. Okay, it'll be a gentleman's bet, or he'd call it something else. Excuse after excuse, and finally he declined. But that did not stop us. We went ahead and said, what would have happened if he had accepted the bet? And his position was, we're at the tipping point. It's almost too late. My point is, 10 years is too short. I mean, I figure I could lose this bet because of natural variation. In fact, we did some 150-year simulations, Crichton did, and figured out I had about a 33% chance of losing this bet. But that wasn't my point. My point is to get people interested in validation. Well, it turns out after 5 years, I'm pretty far ahead now, so I think it's almost I won 4 out of the first 5 years, and ahead quite a bit right now. Updated monthly at the climatebet.com. That's what the graph looks like. Not surprising to you people. Long-term validation study. As I said, the golden rule is particularly important in this situation. So we decided that probably the best forecast is the no-change model. Same way that Julian did that. You know, we have all these conflicts about causal forces. We have uncertainty. So we used the no-change model, and we used 0.03 degrees centigrade per year. We used the Hadley Center's data from 1850 to 2007, and we said, well, who makes a better forecast, the IPCC assumption or the no-change assumption? For long-term forecasts, 1 to 100 years ahead, the no-change models, the forecasts, were 1/7 those from the IPCC. And the gains are even higher for longer term. From horizons 91 to 100, I missed a line, 1/12. We'll take care of that in the future. So here we have a simple model, but hey, who would pay us a lot of money to give you this forecast that temperatures won't change? That's a problem we have with using the...
I'm guessing this for yes.
Okay. Shortcomings in our validation study is we think we can do a better job. Using the latest year is not the smartest thing. There's this notion of nowcasting. How can we better forecast where we're starting from? There's measurement error. There's error each year. So we can improve on that. We could adjust for known biases. You know, in the Hadley data, it's probably overestimated by a factor of 2, as we learned yesterday. We can consider damp trends. You know, there might be short-term trends. You have things like volcanoes and El Nino and so forth. So I think that's possible. We can combine evidence-based forecasts, but it's Keston and I working on this, and Willie, and we had no funding, and our errors were so small that we figured, well, it doesn't matter if we improve it. They're still going to, still can't beat it. The note, for example, if you forecast 50, we had a whole bunch of 50-year ahead forecasts, and the average error, irrespective of sign, mean absolute percentage error, was 0.24 degrees centigrade. Then an independent validation, following good procedures, I think, was made by my good friend Robert Fields and Corentis, and was published in the International Journal of Forecasting. I was telling somebody about this. This is an interesting study. Robert's my good friend, and he never told me about this. And they had commentators. I was not asked to be a commentator. I mean, I've published on the global warming in this journal, which was another story. But so we looked at, and we said Robert did a nice job. He looked at short-term forecasts only. He didn't go out to 100 years. He tested the accuracy of 6 different extrapolation models that are well accepted for this type of situation. He didn't say which of those 6 would be better. So, as I say, a good evidence-based thing. These are some of the good things about that forecast. Doing everything right. Had the same problem we did. We're using the Hadley data, so that's a problem. So we're back on the trail again. We're deciding we should write a response to Robert, but we got ambitious, and now we're going to do just a complete review of evidence-based forecasting. Here's what Robert's thinks. From 1 to 20 years ahead, the forecast had almost 1,200 forecasts, and the improvement of their model there wasn't an improvement. Our model did better, no change. Even after they made these improvements, the naive model was 2% more accurate. And same as you go on a longer time period, we gain more. Short-term validation of the polar bear forecast, tipping point issue. So as I mentioned before, Senator Boxer didn't want to bet on this. Evidence since the findings suggests that the polar bear population has increased. And Mitch Taylor is working on this. He's very careful. He's not willing to come out with a final version. He'll keep working on it. So if you'd like an update, Mitch will have something out in a few months. So the extension in the paper we're working on now is to say, let's consider causal forces. Let's damp trends strongly due to complexity and uncertainty. Adjust validation data for known biases. Use alternative validation. And increase the number of... So we're doing a lot of things to go back to our original study, do another validation. Does it make any difference? We think we might have knocked about 1% off of the no change model for forecast up to 10 years. After that, no change. So even after we make all the improvements we can find, and we still need to do more with respect to nowcasting, we might get another percentage improvement. We have additional validation data than we had a few years ago. That supports it. Forecast errors are really small. Is there any economic benefit to improving them further beyond what the no change model can do? So global change is an anti-scientific movement. How am I doing on time, Art?
19 minutes.
19, okay, good. So we decided, well, we know about forecasting. Let's treat it as a political movement and forecast what's the outcome of the political movement. And again, Julian Simon was there before we were. Julian, in the early 1990s, said, this is a bunch of silliness, it'll blow over in a few years. That was a bad forecast. But he also had a list of catastrophes that might occur in the world and what happens to these forecasts about these catastrophes. London's going to flood and so forth. The Madness of Crowds has that's a very old book with a lot of examples. So we're trying to update what Julian did and looking at analogies. Analogies are often used when you're selling a forecast. People say, well, it's just like such and such, why should we attack, Iraq or something? Well, Jefferson did all right when he sent the fleet over to the Mediterranean, So it turns out that it's a good way to sell a forecast, but it's a bad way to forecast. Once you come up with an analogy, it looks very realistic. And if you make it more detailed, lots of causal links, more detailed, when you make it more detailed, that makes it less likely to occur, right? This is part of the Kahneman and Tversky things. But in fact, the analogies harm your forecast. So we said, well, there's got to be some good information that experts have. So what we decided to do is ask experts to tell us about analogies. And then we take the analogies and we find out what happened in those analogies. And then we have a clerk figure out, what's most likely to happen in this current situation. It turns out if you give them back to the forecasters, they muck it up again. So you have a clerk make the forecast. And that turns out to be what we call the structured analogies. And it works rather well. You generate analogies, assess similarity. We get thumbnail sketches of each one. Then we assess the outcomes, and then we forecast the target. We've also, Keston and I have also been involved with trying to get the CIA and other parts of the defense establishment. And we get invited to Washington, but people don't like what we have to say. We say here's some structured methods that can be used to forecast, but we haven't had too much success in getting them to adopt these methods. We took 8 conflict situations. Conflict situations are very difficult to forecast. Here's an example. These are things that already occurred, but we disguised them, and we checked to make sure people didn't know about them. Artists in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, they went on protest many years ago. And of course, the Netherlands is a big supporter of the arts. And they came up with this program in the government that if an artist cannot sell his artwork, the government will buy it from him. You would think it would be for zero because that's the market price, but no. So a few years later, all the government buildings are getting filled up with these pieces of artwork, and artists are coming from all over Europe and the US to do their art in Amsterdam. So the government decided this is senseless, we have to stop it. And so there was a big sit-in. The artists tie up the museum, they're there, it's not right to do this. So we asked experts what would happen, and we also used structured analogies. And we also used another technique, which is called simulated interaction, where we have people role-play the situation. And it turns out that the structured analogies and the simulated interaction gives very good forecast. The opinions of experts are hardly any better than chance. You're given like 3 or 4 possible outcomes, and as far as experts are concerned, you can just choose randomly and do as well as they do. They get, on average, if you just pick randomly, I think it was something like you get 28% right. The experts get something like 30% right. We get well over 50% for the methods we're using. Oh, there they are right there. 28% for guessing. Experts get 32. And structured analogies when they have 2 or more analogies, the information is even better than if an expert only comes up with 1 analogy. So we'll take like a dozen people, and then we'll take the best analogy from each person, and the mode becomes the forecast. Analogies to global warming. At first we started out, it was tough to find any, but then we checked the literature and we asked a lot of people for examples, and we came up with 71. The literature was kind of nice too, and actually listening to some of the talks, I'm pretty sure we've missed some after I heard yesterday what some people had to say. At 26% met our criteria, which are it's a catastrophe, it's man-made, and it's going to harm the physical environment. So we said, well, what happened in these 26 analogous situations? And we can use that to forecast what's going to happen to global warming. This is not yet finished. It's another one of those things that Kes and I have been working on for, 5 years. Slowly so far. None of these analogies were based on scientific evidence. It's usually some newspaper report about somebody thought something harmed them, and then this goes national, and pretty soon you've got people jumping on the bandwagon. In all cases, government action is recommended to solve the problem. Examples of analogies are uncontrolled reproduction and degeneration. That's in 1883. That went through the early 1900s. Michael Crichton, that's one of his favorite. I love the appendix in his book, State of Fear. I was not a fan of Michael Crichton until one of my colleagues says, you absolutely have to read it if you're going to be in the global warming thing. So it's a fun little novel, but the appendix is wonderful. Soil erosion, DDT and cancer, population growth and famine, electrical wiring and cancer, mercury in fish, global, it goes on. Outcomes of these analogies, government took action in 23 of the 26 analogies. None of them came true. The movement gradually fades, and we need to do more in this to figure out what gradually means. It looks very gradually with respect to global warming because there's so much money tied up in this. And of course, the government expenditures last years, we still have stuff from the Great Depression where we used to, when people didn't have enough food, where we destroyed food to solve the problem, Things like that are still around today. So it's a part of a social phenomenon, but the harmful effects will continue for quite some time, we think. So this is what Julian said in 1992. The environmental alarmists are motivated by, he's always so far ahead of me, He's only 5 years older. And he concluded, again, that the doomsayers' forecasts were always wrong and the environment keeps getting better. He spoke at the first Earth Day, and I think Paul Ehrlich was giving a talk down there, and they filled up the mall or something when Paul Ehrlich talked. Julian said, I think he had about 35 people in the room, people that showed up to hear him. We know a lot about persuasion. I think we should start using this. I don't know how to go about getting the money for it, but the global warmers do not know much about persuasion techniques. So I think this is a wonderful way we can address things because we have the good arguments. The problem is when you have a man-made disaster, and this is actually, Sunstein did this, the head of the regulatory group, and it's a lot. He refuses to answer my emails anymore. But I used to have a dialogue with him. But he did this wonderful study. He shows that if you say, this really bad thing is going to happen, and there's a 1 in 10 chance it's going to happen, should we take action? How likely is it? And yeah, sure, we should take action. All right, instead of 1 in 10, it's 1 in 10,000. And what happens? Same answer. 1 in 10 million, same answer. It's insensitive to the probability. That's illogical, isn't it? But these are all situations where you're spending other people's money. If you ask people to spend their own money, people maybe would be willing to spend $1 a gallon for tax to solve. If you could solve the global warming problem with $1, how much would you be willing to spend in taxes on gasoline? And then the numbers I've seen have been about $1. So they're not willing to spend much of their own money. So protection against this immense danger, a few people gain at the expense of the masses. Things are changing, I think. When you have a low involvement situation, low involvement was me in 2007. I didn't know much about global warming. I had a chance to give a talk about this. I assumed it must be right because I kept reading about it. So repetition is very persuasive when people are not very involved. I think the Germans knew something about that a number of years ago. They said something about it even. Emotion and stories are very effective. Everybody can remember that poor little polar bear on the floe of ice, And then I find out these things they can swim 100 miles, They're high involvement. When something becomes important, people start paying more attention. So if you do not have strong evidence, you should not keep repeating lies. So high involvement would be, say you kept reading that Bolivia has wonderful beaches, and you keep reading that, and you just might start believing it. But then you're planning a trip, you're going to go to on vacation, you can't find the beaches, so so high involvement is one of the major things about persuasion. And also, when you get high involvement, evidence becomes more important than stories. I mean, they can make up much better stories, right, about all these calamities. And then we have these things about how great life is and how it was. That's not newsworthy. In doing so, I like Lincoln's advice. I find I have trouble following it myself sometimes, but there's nothing stronger than gentleness. So just get our story out there, present it in a rational, calm way, keep repeating it. And there's gee, how many do I have? I have 95 persuasion principles. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, 195 persuasion principles there. In fact, as a result of that book, that's why I have these very dull overheads. And everybody says, well, why don't you put colors and everything? I said, well, that's not what the evidence tells me. Somebody likened it, you're trying to tell a story, you want them to see the story. Imagine you have a window. You don't want to have a really fancy window they're looking at. They'll pay attention to the window. You want them to be able to be unaware that you have the window. Beatrice Wardy, 1932. It's called transparency. Yeah. Okay. You might be interested to know in your everyday life what works and what doesn't work. So I find it helps my everyday life to have a wife because she keeps telling me, not now. One-on-one discussions with people who are global warmers are harmful to persuasion. They actually increase the beliefs of that person. It goes back to Festinger's studies and especially the better your argument, the more damage you cause yourself. And of course you can have personal damage if they're friends. So most of my friends are liberals, and I have to be careful. So they have code words they'll tell me, that it's not time for me to talk about certain things. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, not just global warming. Logical arguments, there's this interesting research, it hasn't been carried very far, but they give these little tests to people, like you go to see a movie and you think you're in there for a few minutes, you think, this movie's terrible, this is a waste of time. And then you're given choices, what's your decision? Well, I can leave now, and it goes up to about 4 different things. That's at one, so leave now, and the other is, hey, I paid $10 for this movie, I'm gonna stay. And some people answer this illogical, violation of sunk cost thing, and other people are actually, well, when you're dealing with the irrational, well, not the rational people, the ones that don't have economic rationality, logic doesn't help. Those are the people that read the New York Times, I think, and and was 2007 a tipping point? I don't think for temperature though, but I think for persuasion. I think we're starting to make more inroads, and I think it's going to continue. It's becoming a high involvement issue. It supports being interrupted. Mark Morano sent me one thing showing a couple of years ago that the number of people in the US that believe in dangerous man-made global warming was 37%, which is the same as the number of people that believe in haunted houses. Okay, I have links to key papers, and we'll post the slides. The evidence-based forecasting for climate change, the one that Keston and Willie and I are working on, is still in pretty bad shape, but we'll have it in good shape in a few months. So if we'll put it on, I'll put something here so you can link to it when it comes in the future. We seek peer review. I'm a big fan of peer review. I love peer review, except when it's used to decide whether your paper should be published or whether you should get a grant. It's, I talked to Julian Simon about this. He couldn't get grants either. I said, I can't get grants. He said, we're never going to get grants. You just have to go on. The grants get rid of all the new and important ideas. And I've got about 32 papers on peer review. So I even have an author's formula, which has, I forget all the rules, but don't pick an important problem. If you happen to pick an important problem, don't find interesting results. Write in a way that people have difficulty in understanding. There's a few of these. And these are, it seems like whimsical, but they're actually based on research studies, some of which I've done. So that's it. Now, I have warned you that I don't know much about global warming, right?
No, that's fine. Thanks for your talk, your comment, your question about are we at the best, what would be the best temperature? I think it was Robert Nozick, the philosopher at Harvard, who asked the question, how could we tell if we were in the best of all real possible worlds? A world where there still is evil, disease, climate disasters? Answer, anything we do to change the situation would make the situation worse.
Yes, we're working on another, Keston and I are working on another paper called it's another paper in the iron law of regulation. No matter how egregious the effects of the free market, attempts by the government to improve things will invariably make things worse.
Is there time for a statement? I'm glad you talked about evidence-based forecasting. Evidence-based medicine is the most powerful ideological agent in medical research at this time. It's not always right, but it's powerful. And all scientific physicians are supposed to believe that you don't do a new treatment or make a new change in your policies unless you have class 1 evidence. It's interesting, however, that the government has changed the whole system of administering medicine radically to the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, without any experiment or any evidence whatsoever.
It will fail. Yeah. Thanks, sir.